A single mother was humiliated at the supermarket, unaware that a millionaire was watching everything. When he approached her, no one could have imagined what he would say. Sarah woke up to the loud beeping of her alarm. It was 5:30 a.m., and her body felt heavy. She sat up, rubbing her face, trying to get rid of the fatigue. The small apartment was still dark, with just a sliver of morning light coming through the curtain. Dylan, her 5-year-old son, was asleep in the corner of the room, wrapped in his blanket. "Come on, Sarah. You got this," she whispered to herself, standing up. She walked to the tiny kitchen and started making breakfast. There wasn't much, some toast and a few scrambled eggs. She kept her eye on the time. They needed to leave by 7. She glanced at the overdue bills on the counter. The electric bill was at the top of the pile, stamped with a red, "Final Notice." Her chest tightened. "Mommy?" Dylan's sleepy voice broke her thoughts. "Morning, sweetheart. Ready for breakfast?" Sarah forced a smile, scooping the eggs onto a plate. Dylan nodded, rubbing his eyes as he climbed onto the chair. Sarah watched him eat, her heart feeling both full and broken. She hated that this was the best she could do for him. She quickly made herself a coffee, ignoring the rumbling in her stomach. There wasn't enough for both of them to eat well. "All right, buddy, let's get you dressed," she said, trying to keep her voice cheerful. By 7, they were out the door. The walk to the daycare was a short one, but it felt longer with the weight of everything on Sarah's mind. She dropped Dylan off with a kiss on his forehead, promising to pick him up later. She could see the other kids with their lunchboxes, new shoes, and bright smiles. She tried not to compare. At the supermarket, Sarah slipped on her uniform and stood at her register. The shift was long. She rang up groceries, smiled at customers, and dealt with rude comments. By midday, her feet ached and her stomach growled. She ignored both, focusing on the beep of each item passing through the scanner. During her break, her phone buzzed. It was the bank. "Miss Sarah Johnson," a man's voice said. "This is a courtesy call to remind you that your loan payment is overdue. If it's not resolved by the end of the week, further action will be taken." Sarah closed her eyes, holding back tears. "I understand. I'll take care of it." The call ended, leaving her staring at the wall. She thought of Dylan, and of everything she had tried to do on her own since his father left. She felt her throat tighten, the same old pain resurfacing. "Hey, Johnson, break's over," her manager called. Sarah took a deep breath, wiping her eyes before stepping back to her register. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Later that evening, Sarah picked Dylan up from daycare. He was smiling, holding up a picture he'd drawn. "Look, Mommy, it's us." Sarah smiled, her heart aching. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Let's go home." They walked back to the apartment, and the exhaustion was almost unbearable. When they got inside, there was another reminder waiting for her, the landlord's note, slipped under the door. "Final notice, rent due immediately." Sarah sank onto the couch, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Dylan sat beside her, resting his head on her arm. "Mommy, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah forced another smile. "I'm okay, baby. Just tired." When Dylan fell asleep that night, Sarah stayed awake. Tears streamed down her face as she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. She was out of options. She thought about all the sacrifices she'd made, all the times she'd put on a brave face for Dylan. And now, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending. She looked at Dylan, curled up peacefully, and whispered, "I'm so sorry, baby." Sarah felt trapped. Between the bills, the landlord's ultimatum, and the bank breathing down her neck, it was too much. She rested her head in her hands, her body shaking as she cried quietly, hoping not to wake Dylan. The next morning, She got up, her eyes red and swollen. She had to keep going. There was no other choice. "All right, Dylan. Let's get ready for another day," she said, her voice barely holding up. Sarah stood at her register, her eyes scanning the groceries one by one as the familiar beep echoed. She forced a smile for each customer, though her mind was still on the overdue bills and her exhaustion weighed heavy. It was mid-morning when an older man stepped up to her counter. He frowned at the line, clearly irritated. "Can you hurry it up a bit?" the man said, his tone sharp. Sarah nodded. "Of course, sir. Just a moment," she replied, her hands moving faster to scan the items. The man sighed loudly, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. I don't know why they hire people who can't even do the basics right." Sarah felt her face grow hot, her fingers fumbling with the bags. She glanced over at Dylan, who was sitting nearby in the corner, coloring in his notebook. He looked up, sensing something was wrong. "I'm sorry for the wait," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man wasn't having it. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a sneer. "People like you shouldn't even be here. You're just wasting everyone's time." Sarah swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She didn't look up, just kept scanning the groceries, wishing she could disappear. Dylan's eyes widened, and he dropped his crayon, his small face scrunching up in confusion. "Mommy?" he called, his voice trembling. Sarah looked over at Dylan, her heart breaking at the worry in his eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just keep coloring, all right?" she said, her voice soft but strained. "Hey, back off," a man's voice interrupted, clear and firm. Sarah looked up, startled. A tall man with a kind face stood at the next register. It was William, one of the regulars. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing at the rude customer. "Is there a problem here?" William asked, his tone challenging. The older man huffed, clearly caught off guard. "No problem at all," he muttered, grabbing his bags quickly and storming off. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her eyes meeting William's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. William gave her a small nod. "No one should talk to you like that. Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle now. Sarah forced a smile, though her eyes were teary. "Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you, really." William glanced at Dylan, who was staring at them with wide eyes, and then back at Sarah. He seemed to consider something for a moment before speaking. "If you need anything, help, or just someone to talk to, I'm around," he said, handing her a small card. Sarah took the card, her fingers trembling. She didn't want to take it, didn't want to need help, but the kindness in his eyes made her hesitate. "Thank you, but I'll be okay," she said, trying to smile. William nodded, not pushing it. "Just in case," he said before walking away. Sarah slipped the card into her pocket, her heart heavy. She hated feeling weak, hated that someone had to step in to help her in front of Dylan. It was humiliating, a reminder of just how powerless she was right now. The rest of the shift dragged on, and by the time it ended, Sarah was drained. She picked up Dylan, who had fallen asleep on the chair, and carried him out to the bus stop. The ride home was quiet, the weight of the day pressing down on her. Back at the apartment, Sarah laid Dylan down on the couch, covering him with a thin blanket. She sank into the kitchen chair, pulling out the card William had given her. It was simple, just his name and a phone number. She turned it over in her hand, unsure. The doorbell rang suddenly, making her jump. She opened the door to find a notice taped to it. The landlord's name scrawled at the bottom. Another warning about the rent. Sarah tore it down, her hands shaking. She glanced at Dylan, sleeping peacefully, and the tears she had held back all day finally spilled over. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with silent sobs. She was running out of time, out of options, and she didn't know what to do anymore. "Mommy?" Dylan's small voice called, his eyes half open as he looked at her. Sarah quickly wiped her face, forcing a smile. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm okay, just tired," she said, her voice cracking. Dylan climbed off the couch and hugged her tightly. Sarah held him close, closing her eyes, trying to gather the strength to keep going. It was just one more day, she told herself. She just had to get through one more day. At the end of her shift, Sarah was exhausted. She rubbed her eyes, trying to focus as she closed out her register. The last customer had just left, and the store was finally quiet. She sighed, reaching for the cash drawer when she heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Sarah." She looked up, startled. William was standing there, holding a grocery bag. He gave her a small smile, his eyes showing concern. "William?" she said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged. "I thought I'd check on you. You seemed pretty shaken up earlier." Sarah forced a smile. "It's nothing. Just another day, you know?" William shook his head. "It didn't look like nothing. Look, I know it's none of my business, but I want to help, financially, if that's what you need." Sarah blinked, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and pride. I don't need charity, William," she said, her voice firm, but her hands trembled as she shut the register. He held up his hands, palms out. "I get it. It's not charity. Think of it as a loan, or just a friend trying to help another friend." Sarah looked away, biting her lip. The truth was, she needed help more than anything. But the thought of taking money from someone she barely knew terrified her. It made her feel weak, and she hated that feeling. "I appreciate it, really," she said, her voice soft. "But I'll be okay. I've made it this far." William studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small card. "Take this. My number's on it. If you change your mind, or if you just need someone to talk to, give me a call." Sarah hesitated before taking the card. She looked at it for a moment before slipping it into her pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. William nodded. "Just don't be afraid to ask for help, all right?" Sarah nodded, though she didn't say anything. She watched as William turned and walked away, the store door closing behind him with a soft chime. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The ride home with Dylan was quiet. He was tired, his head resting on her shoulder as the bus bumped along the road. Sarah looked out the window, her thoughts swirling. William's offer had caught her off guard, but the kindness in his eyes had felt genuine. Still, she wasn't sure she could bring herself to ask for help, even if she needed it. When they got back to the apartment, Sarah found another notice taped to the door. She tore it down before Dylan could see, her hands trembling as she read it. The creche fees were overdue again. She didn't know how she'd managed to cover everything. Inside, she set Dylan up with his coloring books, trying to keep her voice cheerful. "You be good for a bit, okay, sweetheart? Mommy's just got a little work to do." Dylan nodded, his eyes still tired. "Okay, Mommy." Sarah sat at the small kitchen table, her head in her hands. The card William had given her felt heavy in her pocket, like a reminder of everything she was failing at. She pulled it out, staring at his name and number. She didn't want to call him. She didn't want to need anyone. But the thought of Dylan losing his place at the creche made her stomach twist. She needed that time to work. And if he couldn't go, everything would fall apart even faster. She put the card down, her eyes closing as she tried to think. Maybe there was another way. Maybe she could pick up more hours at the store, work overnight shifts, anything. Later that evening, She called her mother, hoping for some advice or even a little comfort. But the conversation turned into another argument. "Sarah, you have to be realistic," her mother said, her voice sharp. "You can't keep struggling like this. If someone is offering help, take it. Stop being so stubborn." "I'm not being stubborn," Sarah argued, her voice rising. "I just don't want to owe anyone. I can do this on my own." "You've been trying to do it on your own for years, and look where it's gotten you. You need to think about Dylan." "Don't you think I know that?" Sarah snapped, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm doing everything I can for him." Her mother sighed. "I know you are, but sometimes doing everything you can means letting someone else in. Just think about it, okay?" Sarah ended the call, feeling more alone than ever. She sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Dylan came over, climbing into her lap, his small arms wrapping around her. "Love you, Mommy," he said, his voice muffled against her chest. Sarah held him close, her eyes closing. "I love you too, sweetheart, so much." That night, as Dylan slept beside her, Sarah lay awake, her mind racing. She thought about William, about the card still sitting on the kitchen table. She hated the idea of needing someone else. But maybe her mother was right. Maybe it wasn't just about her anymore. In the end, she decided she would keep trying a little longer. She'd ask for extra hours at the store, do whatever she could to make it work. If all else failed, then maybe she'd call William. She looked over at Dylan, his face peaceful in sleep. She reached over, brushing a curl of hair away from his forehead. "Everything's going to be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was saying it for him or herself. The following morning, Sarah was at the supermarket earlier than usual. She'd decided to talk to her manager about picking up extra hours. It was a desperate move, but she had to try. She stood by the office door, tapping her fingers nervously on the frame. "Mr. Davis, do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Mr. Davis, a tall man in his late 50s, looked up from his paperwork. He frowned slightly, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Sarah, what is it?" "I was wondering if I could pick up any extra hours," she said quickly. "I really need more shifts." Mr. Davis sighed, shaking his head. "We're already stretched thin with the schedule. There's not much room for overtime." Sarah's heart sank. "Please, Mr. Davis, anything you have. I can work nights, weekends, whatever it takes." He stared at her for a moment, then let out a reluctant sigh. "All right, I can give you some extra shifts for the next few weekends, but that's it. No guarantees after that." Sarah nodded, her face a mix of relief and anxiety. "Thank you. I really appreciate it. Mr. Davis turned back to his paperwork without another word, and Sarah walked away, her shoulders sagging. It wasn't much, but it was something. She needed to do everything she could. Over the next week, Sarah took on the extra hours, working late into the night while still trying to be there for Dylan during the day. She barely slept, her body running on caffeine and sheer determination. Her feet ached constantly, her back hurt from standing at the register for hours, and her head pounded from the stress. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Sarah returned home, barely able to keep her eyes open. Dylan greeted her at the door, holding up a drawing he'd made. "Mommy, look! I drew us at the park," he said, his eyes bright. Sarah forced a smile, her heart aching. "That's beautiful, baby." "I love it." She knelt down to hug him, her body screaming in protest. Dylan hugged her tightly, but she could tell he was sad. "Are you okay, Mommy?" he asked, his small voice full of worry. Sarah nodded, brushing his hair back. I'm just tired, sweetheart. Mommy's been working a lot, that's all. Dylan frowned, his eyes searching her face. You don't have to work so much. We can just stay here, right? Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell him everything would be all right, but she didn't have the strength to lie. Instead, she just hugged him tighter. The days blurred together. Sarah's exhaustion grew worse, her body barely able to keep up. One day at the supermarket, as she was stocking shelves during her extra shift, she felt the world tilt around her. The shelves spun, her vision darkening. She tried to steady herself, but her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. The last thing she heard before everything went black was someone shouting her name. When Sarah woke up, she was lying in a hospital bed, her head pounding. She blinked, trying to make sense of where she was. The sterile smell and the bright overhead lights were overwhelming. "Mommy!" Dylan's voice came from beside her. Sarah turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Dylan's worried gaze. He was sitting on a chair, his little legs dangling. His face was pale, his eyes red from crying. "Hey, baby," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She reached out, taking his hand. "Mommy, you fell," Dylan said, his lip trembling. "I was so scared." Sarah squeezed his hand, her heart aching. "I'm okay now, sweetheart. I promise." She looked up as a nurse entered the room, a clipboard in her hands. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" Sarah forced a weak smile. "I'm all right, just tired." The nurse nodded, giving her a sympathetic look. "You need rest. You've been pushing yourself too hard." Sarah sighed, nodding slightly. She knew the nurse was right, but resting wasn't an option. Not with rent overdue and bills piling up. "Mommy has to work," Dylan said suddenly, his small voice full of worry. "She always has to work." The nurse looked at Sarah, her eyes softening. "Sometimes it's okay to ask for help, you know." Sarah looked away, her eyes stinging. She didn't want to hear that. She didn't want to admit that she couldn't do this alone. A knock on the door made Sarah look up. William was standing there, his face full of concern. He stepped inside, nodding at the nurse. "Hey, Sarah," he said gently. "I heard what happened. Are you all right?" Sarah blinked, surprised. "William? How did you know?" "I was in the store when it happened," he said, stepping closer. "I saw you fall. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Sarah felt her face flush, embarrassment mixing with exhaustion. "I'm fine, just tired." William nodded, his eyes searching hers. "Sarah, please, let me help you. You don't have to keep doing this alone." Sarah looked down at Dylan, his small hand still gripping hers. She didn't want to be here, in this hospital bed, with her son scared and worried. She didn't want to feel like she was failing him. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting William's. I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. William knelt down beside her bed, his voice soft. "You're not alone, Sarah. Let me help. Whatever you need." Sarah swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She was terrified of needing someone, terrified of what accepting help might mean. But as she looked at Dylan, his innocent face full of worry, she knew she couldn't keep going like this. Maybe it was time to let someone in. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Okay, William." William smiled, relief washing over his face. "Thank you. I promise I'll help you in any way I can." Sarah closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Sarah returned home after her stay in the hospital. She was still weak, but she had to get back to her routine. She couldn't afford to stop, not now. The apartment was just as she left it, cluttered, with Dylan's toys scattered around and the bills piled up on the table. She took a deep breath and looked at Dylan, who was already playing with his toy cars. "Mommy, are you okay now?" he asked, his big eyes filled with concern. Sarah forced a smile, kneeling beside him. "Yes, baby. Mommy's okay. Just a little tired." Dylan nodded, though his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before he went back to his game. Sarah stood up, exhaustion washing over her again. She needed to stay strong for him. The next day, she went back to work. As soon as she entered the supermarket, she could feel it. People whispering, eyes lingering on her. She heard snippets of conversation, her name, and the words hospital and overworked. Her chest tightened. She approached her register, trying to ignore the stares. One of her colleagues, Maria, gave her a sympathetic look. "Hey, Sarah, you okay?" Maria asked, her voice low. Sarah nodded, avoiding eye contact. "I'm fine, Maria. Thanks for asking." Maria hesitated. "You know, some people, they're saying things. Just ignore them, all right? You're doing your best." Sarah forced a smile. "I know, thanks." But it was easier said than done. The whispers continued, and it felt like everyone was judging her, like they knew her life was falling apart, and they enjoyed watching it happen. It hurt more than she wanted to admit. That evening, after her shift, she called her mother. She needed to talk to someone who might understand. But the conversation quickly turned into a fight. "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "Everyone's talking about me. I feel like I'm losing control of everything." Her mother sighed on the other end of the line. "Sarah, maybe you should just accept that man's help. You can't keep doing this to yourself. Or to Dylan." "I'm trying, Mom," Sarah said, her voice rising. "I don't want to rely on anyone. I just need to figure it out." Her mother's tone hardened. "You're being stubborn, Sarah. This isn't just about you. You have a child to think about." Sarah felt her anger bubble up. "You think I don't know that? Everything I do is for Dylan." "Then, maybe it's time to swallow your pride and take the help that's being offered." Sarah clenched her jaw, her hands trembling. She ended the call, tears stinging her eyes. She looked at Dylan, who was drawing quietly at the table. He looked up, giving her a small smile, and it broke her heart. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "How about we watch a movie tonight?" Dylan's face lit up. "Really? Can we watch the one with the talking dog?" Sarah nodded, her heart aching. "Of course, baby." That night, as they watched the movie, Sarah tried to push away her worries. She wrapped her arm around Dylan, feeling the warmth of his small body against hers. She needed to be strong for him. She needed to figure this out. The next morning, Sarah received a message from William. It was simple, just checking on her, asking if she was all right. She stared at the screen for a long time before replying. She thanked him for his concern, not really expecting anything more. But William replied almost immediately, asking if they could meet. He said he had an opportunity that might help her. Sarah hesitated. She still wasn't sure she could trust him. But what other choice did she have? She agreed to meet him. And later that day, she found herself in front of an office building, Dylan holding her hand tightly. They were led to a small office where William was waiting, smiling warmly as they entered. "Sarah, Dylan, I'm glad you could make it," he said, motioning for them to sit. Sarah sat down, her back stiff. "You said you had something to discuss." William nodded. I do. I want to offer you a job, Sarah. It's not charity. It's a position in one of my companies. I think you'd be a great fit. Sarah blinked, taken aback. A job, but I don't have any special skills. You're hardworking, and you're determined, William said. Those are the skills I'm looking for. It's an entry-level position, but it pays better than the supermarket, and you'd have more stable hours. Sarah looked down, her mind racing. A job. A real job. It was everything she needed. But the fear was still there. What if this was just another trap? What if he expected something in return? I don't know, William, she said, her voice barely audible. William leaned forward, his expression soft. I know it's a lot to consider. I don't want you to feel pressured, but I see how hard you're working, and I want to help. No strings attached. Sarah looked at Dylan, who was playing with a small toy car, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting William's. Can I think about it? She asked. William smiled. Of course. Take all the time you need. They left the office, Sarah's mind still spinning. She held Dylan's hand tightly as they walked home, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear, hope, and uncertainty. This could be the break she needed, the chance to give Dylan a better life. But it meant trusting someone else, and that terrified her. That night, as she put Dylan to bed, he looked up at her, his eyes wide. Mommy, are we going to be okay? Sarah swallowed hard, her heart aching. She stroked his hair gently. Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be okay. She hoped it was true. She had to make it true. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor. The past few weeks had taken everything out of her. She had tried so hard to make things work, but it felt like she was failing at every turn. Dylan was asleep beside her, his breathing soft and steady. She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. She felt like she was letting him down. Maybe it would be better if she left, she thought. Maybe if she left Dylan with her mother, he would have a better chance. He wouldn't have to watch her struggle, wouldn't have to feel her stress. The thought of leaving him tore her apart. But the pain of watching him suffer because of her was even worse. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She couldn't give up. Not yet. But the weight of everything felt unbearable. Mommy! Dylan's small voice broke through her thoughts. She looked down, startled to see him awake. His big eyes were filled with concern. What's wrong, sweetheart? She asked, her voice shaky. Are we ever going to live in a big house? He asked, his voice innocent. Sarah felt her heart break. She swallowed hard, trying to find the words. Maybe one day, baby. We just have to keep trying. Dylan nodded, his eyes searching her face. Okay, Mommy, I love you. I love you too, sweetheart, she whispered, her voice cracking. The next morning, Sarah found another notice from the landlord. It was final. Pay up, or they'd be evicted. She felt the panic rise in her chest, her hands trembling as she read the paper. She was out of time. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. William's number was there, just a call away. She didn't want to do it. She hated the idea of asking for help, of admitting that she couldn't do this on her own. But she had no other choice. She picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She hesitated, her heart pounding. But then she thought of Dylan, of the way he'd asked about a better place to live. She couldn't let him down. She dialed the number, her hands shaking. The phone rang, and she almost hung up. But then William answered. Hello? His voice was calm, reassuring. William, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's Sarah. Sarah, hi, how are you? His tone softened. as if he knew what she was going through. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. I need your help, she said, her voice breaking. There was a pause, and then William's voice came, gentle and understanding. Of course, Sarah. I'll do whatever I can. What do you need? Sarah swallowed, tears streaming down her face. I need a place for me and Dylan. I can't keep going like this. William's voice was steady. I understand. Let's meet and figure this out, okay? I'll help you. Sarah nodded, though he couldn't see it. Okay, she whispered. They arranged to meet later that day. When Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a mix of relief and fear. She had done it. She had asked for help, but now she had to face whatever came next. When she met William that afternoon, she felt vulnerable, exposed. They sat at a small cafe, Dylan playing quietly with a toy car at the table. William looked at her, his eyes filled with kindness. Thank you for meeting me, Sarah, he said. Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I don't know what to do anymore, William. I've tried everything, but I just can't make it work. William leaned forward, his voice gentle. You're not alone, Sarah. You don't have to do this by yourself. Let me help you. I can help you find a better place, and I can offer you a job. It's not charity, it's just a chance to get back on your feet. Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice trembling. Why do you want to help me? William smiled, his expression sincere. Because I've been where you are, Sarah. I know what it's like to feel like there's no way out. And I also know that sometimes we all need a little help. You're strong, and you deserve a chance. Sarah swallowed, her heart pounding. She looked at Dylan, who was watching them, his eyes wide. She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. Okay, she said. I'll take the help. William nodded, a look of relief washing over his face. Good. We'll get through this together. Sarah felt the weight on her chest lighten, just a little. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like there was hope. Sarah sat across from William in a small cafe, the afternoon sunlight casting soft shadows across their table. Dylan was sitting beside her, quietly coloring in a notebook. Sarah had spent all night thinking about her decision, and now she was here, ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for meeting me, William said, his voice gentle as he looked at her. Sarah nodded, her hands folded in her lap. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady but soft. I need help, but I don't want charity. I want a loan. I'll pay it back, every cent. William nodded, his expression serious. I understand, and I respect that. This is not charity, Sarah. It's an opportunity. He paused, then continued. I can offer you a job. It's entry level, but it's stable, and it pays better than what you're getting at the supermarket. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this. A job. It wasn't just about money, it was a way forward, a way to build something stable for her and Dylan. But the fear of depending on someone still lingered. What kind of job? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's an office position? Administrative work, William explained. You'd be working with a team, handling basic office tasks, and learning as you go. I think it could be a good fit for you, and it would give you the stability you need. Sarah looked at Dylan, who was focused on his coloring, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. She took a deep breath, trying to push away her doubts. I want to make sure this is fair, she said, her voice firmer now. I don't want special treatment, and I don't want to feel like I owe you anything beyond what's agreed upon. William nodded. That's exactly how it'll be. I want you to succeed, Sarah. Nothing more. Sarah took a moment, then nodded. All right. I'll take the job and the loan, but I'll pay it back. Every bit of it. William smiled, relief evident on his face. I have no doubt you will. The next day, Sarah walked into the office building where she'd be starting her new job. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped through the doors, the hum of activity around her making her feel out of place. She clutched her bag tightly, her palms sweaty. A woman at the reception desk greeted her warmly. You must be Sarah. William told us you'd be starting today. I'll show you around. Sarah followed the woman, taking in the busy environment. There were people on phones, others typing away at their computers. She felt a pang of anxiety, wondering if she'd be able to keep up. She hadn't worked in an office before, and the thought of making a mistake scared her. They reached a small desk in the corner. This will be your workstation, the woman said. I'm Lisa, by the way. If you need anything, just ask. Sarah nodded, offering a small smile. Thank you, Lisa. Lisa left, and Sarah sat down at the desk. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She could do this. She had to do this, for Dylan. She glanced at the picture he'd drawn that morning, which she'd brought with her and placed on the corner of her desk. It was a reminder of why she was here. The first day was tough. Sarah was overwhelmed with the new tasks, the computer systems, and the pace of everything. She made mistakes, and each time she felt a pang of fear of failure, fear of not being good enough. But Lisa was patient, and so were the others. They guided her, answered her questions, and slowly, she started to feel like she might be able to do this. When Sarah got home that evening, she was exhausted but hopeful. Dylan ran to her, hugging her tightly. Mommy, how was your new job? Sarah smiled, lifting him up. It was good, sweetheart. Mommy's learning a lot. Dylan grinned. Can we celebrate? Sarah laughed softly. What do you say we have pancakes for dinner? Dylan's eyes lit up. Yes, pancakes. As they sat together, eating their makeshift celebration dinner, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a small glimmer, but it was there. She looked at Dylan, his face full of happiness, and she knew she had made the right decision. Over the next few weeks, Sarah settled into her new routine. She worked at the office during the day and spent her evenings with Dylan. It was exhausting, but the stability made it worth it. She no longer had to worry about missing rent, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the constant weight of fear pressing down on her. But not everything was easy. Some of her coworkers gave her looks, curious, sometimes judgmental. She knew there were rumors about her and William, whispers that she had only gotten the job because of him. She tried to ignore them, focusing on her work and on doing the best she could. But the whispers hurt. They made her feel like she didn't belong, like she was an outsider. One afternoon, Lisa approached her desk. Hey, Sarah, do you want to join us for lunch today? Sarah looked up, surprised. She hesitated, then nodded. Sure, I'd love to. At lunch, she sat with Lisa and a few others, the conversation light and casual. They talked about work, their lives outside of the office, and slowly, Sarah started to feel a bit more comfortable. She laughed at one of Lisa's jokes, and for a moment, she forgot about the whispers, about the judgment. She felt like she was part of something. That evening, as she walked home with Dylan, he looked up at her, his eyes bright. Mommy, are you happy now? Sarah looked down at him, her heart swelling. She knelt down, cupping his face in her hands. I'm getting there, sweetheart, and it's all because of you. Dylan smiled, hugging her tightly. I love you, Mommy. I love you too, baby, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For the first time, Sarah felt like she was on the right path. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. And that was enough. Sarah's new routine had finally begun to settle. Each morning, she got Dylan ready for school, packed his small lunchbox, and made sure he was prepared for the day ahead. Then, she'd take the bus to her new job at William's company. It was different from anything she had done before, but she found herself adjusting. The office environment was busy but welcoming, and she slowly began to feel a sense of belonging. "Good morning, Sarah," Lisa greeted as she walked in one Monday morning. Lisa was one of her co-workers who had taken the time to show Sarah the ropes. She always had a smile on her face, and it made the transition a little less daunting. "Morning, Lisa," Sarah replied with a genuine smile. She walked over to her desk and took a deep breath, feeling more confident today. She looked at Dylan's drawing on her desk, a colorful picture of the two of them, and felt a sense of purpose. The tasks were still challenging, but Sarah discovered skills she never knew she had. She learned to organize paperwork, respond to emails, and manage schedules. It was all new, but she felt herself growing, and every time she felt unsure, she reminded herself of why she was here. Dylan. One day, her supervisor approached her. "Sarah, you've been doing well," he said, nodding approvingly. "I want you to start taking on some of the more detailed tasks. You've shown you can handle it." Sarah was stunned. She'd been so used to being overlooked, to being dismissed as someone who couldn't do more. But now, someone believed in her. "Thank you," she said, her voice full of gratitude. That night, Sarah shared the news with her mother over the phone. "They want me to do more. They trust me," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. Her mother sighed on the other end. "I knew you could do it, Sarah. I'm proud of you." The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. She closed her eyes, feeling a sense of peace. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. It wasn't just her job that was changing. Sarah was changing too. She found herself reconnecting with her mother, trying to mend the rift that had grown between them. It was slow and awkward at times, but they were making progress. She no longer felt completely alone. One afternoon, Sarah sat with William during her break. He had been nothing but supportive, offering her a helping hand without pushing her beyond her comfort zone. She felt a growing sense of respect for him, and their relationship had become more of a friendship than she had expected. "I see you're doing well here," William said, his smile warm. "Everyone's been talking about your work." Sarah looked down, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm trying my best." William nodded. "And it shows. You're a hard worker, Sarah. You're capable of so much more than you give yourself credit for." Sarah smiled, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, William. I wouldn't have gotten here without you." William shook his head. "You got here because you chose to fight. I just opened a door." Sarah knew he was right. She had been the one to push through, to take the chance even when it scared her. She was starting to realize that asking for help didn't make her weak. It made her strong enough to admit that she couldn't do it alone. At home, Dylan seemed happier too. His face was brighter, his laughter came more easily, and the weight that had once hung over their small apartment seemed to lift. Sarah noticed the way he played, his energy more vibrant, his smiles bigger. The stability was good for him, and it showed. "Mommy, can we go to the park this weekend?" Dylan asked one evening as they sat together on the couch. Sarah smiled, ruffling his hair. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll make a whole day of it." Dylan beamed, hugging her tightly. "I love you, Mommy." "I love you too, baby," she whispered, holding him close. That weekend, Sarah and Dylan spent the entire day at the park. They played on the swings, ran through the grass, and even had a small picnic. It was the first time in a long time that Sarah felt truly happy, not just pretending for Dylan's sake. It was real, and it was enough. Back at work, Sarah continued to push herself. She still faced challenges, and there were still days when she doubted herself. But she was beginning to understand that it was all part of the journey. She was learning, growing, and making a life for herself and for Dylan, one step at a time. One day, as she sat at her desk, William approached her. "Sarah, I want to talk to you about something," he said, his expression serious but kind. Sarah looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "Is everything okay?" William nodded. "Yes, everything is fine. I wanted to talk to you about your future here. I think there's room for you to grow, to take on more responsibility. If you're interested, I'd like to help you move forward." Sarah blinked, the words sinking in slowly. You want me to do more?" William smiled. "I believe in you, Sarah. I think you're capable of great things, and I want to help you get there." Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, William. I'd like that." She knew she still had a long way to go. There were still bills to pay, still challenges to face. But now, there was hope. There was a future, and she was ready to fight for it. Sarah sat at her small kitchen table, a stack of bills in front of her, but this time, they didn't overwhelm her. She had a plan, she had a job, she had stability. The panic that had once gripped her every time she looked at her finances was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and control. It was payday, and today was a special day. Sarah was going to make her first repayment to William. She had insisted on it being a loan, not a gift, and she was determined to honor that promise. She smiled at Dylan, who was sitting across from her, drawing happily. His face was brighter now, his laughter more frequent, and Sarah knew that all her struggles were finally paying off. "Mommy, can we buy ice cream today?" Dylan asked, his eyes hopeful. Sarah laughed. "Yes, sweetheart. Today, we can definitely get ice cream." Later that afternoon, Sarah walked into William's office. She held an envelope tightly in her hand, her heart pounding. It wasn't much, just the first installment of the loan, but it was a start. She knocked lightly on the door, and William looked up, smiling as he saw her. "Sarah, come in," he said warmly. She stepped inside, taking a deep breath. "I wanted to give you this," she said, handing him the envelope. "It's the first repayment." William took the envelope, his eyes softening. He nodded, his smile gentle. "I knew you'd keep your word, Sarah. But you know, there's no rush. I want you to take care of yourself and Dylan first." Sarah shook her head. "No, I need to do this. I need to prove to myself that I can." William looked at her for a moment, then nodded again. "I respect that. You're doing an amazing job, Sarah. You should be proud." Sarah felt her eyes sting with tears, but she blinked them back. "Thank you, William, for everything." William smiled. "You don't need to thank me. You got here on your own." As Sarah left the office, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She was finally taking control of her life, one step at a time, and it felt good. That evening, Sarah picked Dylan up from school. His teacher had a wide smile on her face as she approached Sarah. "Mrs. Johnson, I just wanted to tell you how well Dylan is doing," the teacher said. "He's really thriving. He's such a bright boy." Sarah's heart swelled with pride. She looked down at Dylan, who was beaming up at her. "Thank you. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," she said, kneeling to hug him tightly. Dylan giggled, hugging her back. Can we get ice cream now? Sarah laughed, wiping a tear from her eye. Yes, we can. Let's go. They walked to the small ice cream shop down the street, Dylan chattering excitedly about his day. As they sat on a bench, eating their ice cream, Sarah looked at her son, her heart full. This was what she had fought for. This peace. This joy. Mommy, are we going to be okay now? Dylan asked, his eyes serious as he looked at her. Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair away from his face. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. A few days later, Sarah and William met at a cafe. It had become a routine. Every now and then, they'd sit and talk, not as employer and employee, but as friends. William looked at Sarah, his eyes thoughtful. Sarah, I wanted to tell you something, he said, his voice softer than usual. I never told you much about my past, but I think it's time you knew why I wanted to help you. Sarah looked at him, curiosity in her eyes. She nodded, listening intently. I grew up in a situation not so different from yours, William began. My mom was a single mother, and she struggled every day to make ends meet. I remember what it was like to watch her fight, to watch her sacrifice everything for me. And I remember how much it meant when someone reached out and helped us. That's why I wanted to help you, because I saw that same strength in you. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't expected that. She reached across the table, placing her hand on his. Thank you for sharing that, William. And thank you for everything you've done for me and Dylan. William smiled, his eyes softening. You don't need to thank me, Sarah. Just promise me that you'll keep fighting, no matter what. Sarah nodded, her heart full. I promise. As the weeks went by, Sarah found herself dreaming again. She began to think about the future, not just in terms of survival, but in terms of growth. She wanted to save up, to move to a better place for her and Dylan, to give him the life he deserved. One evening, as she sat with Dylan on the couch, she looked at him, her heart swelling with love. Dylan, how would you like to move to a new house someday? A place with a big yard where you can play? Dylan's eyes widened, a smile spreading across his face. Really, Mommy? That would be amazing! Sarah smiled, hugging him tightly. One day, sweetheart, we're going to make it happen. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. She believed in a future where she and Dylan would be okay, where they would thrive. She knew there would still be challenges, still be obstacles to overcome, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. She looked out the window, the sky darkening as the stars began to appear. She held Dylan close, her heart full of hope and determination. Everything's going to be okay, she whispered, her voice steady. And for the first time, she truly believed it.